Hello, my name's Dale Matchak. I'm the chairman of the Econ program at Northwood University. Welcome to the Freedom Seminar. This morning's lecture is presented by Dr. Mark Perry, who's a professor of economics of finance in the School of Management at the University of Michigan, Flint. He's also a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., and he's probably best known to many of you as the creator of the Carpe Diem blog at the American Enterprise Institute. Now, if you haven't read this blog before, you're going to spend a lot of time in the archives. There are some real classics that he's written and continues to produce. And I put a link to his blog there in the chat section. So I encourage you to check that out. Not till after his presentation, but definitely do check out the Carpe Diem blog. There's some real treasures in there. But obviously, he's also a scholar. He has his Ph.D. from George Mason University and his MBA degree in finance from the University of Minnesota. He's widely published in academic journals, and his opinion pieces have appeared in more than 20 newspapers in the state of Michigan alone, and also in major national papers such as the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and USA Today, and Investor's Business Daily. Now, today he's going to talk to us about Title IX, and he's not going to talk to us merely from an impersonal perspective, but he's actually been deeply involved in the enforcement of Title IX. I'm sure for those of you that don't know what Title IX is, he's going to explain to you what it is. It's an important piece of our civil rights legislation having to do with college campuses. And I think I will let him explain what he's been doing and what the results have been. Would you please welcome Dr. Mark Perry?
Well, thanks very much, Dale. I'm happy to be back for the second year in a row, and I think I participated, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago or so in the Freedom Seminar. And so my talk today is about my efforts to challenge what I call systemic sexism in higher education and expose the thousands of illegal violations of Title IX's clear prohibition of sex discrimination. And so it's consistent with the theme of this year's Freedom Seminar because Title IX guarantees justice for all in higher education, regardless of sex, and that's what has motivated me to pursue what I've called my one-man mission to advance civil rights and Title IX for all in higher education and not just for some preferred groups. And just some background is that, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin in any program or activity that receives federal funds, but it didn't include sex discrimination. And so feminist and women's rights activists in the early 1970s lobbied Congress to add sex as a protected class. And so what's called Title IX was enacted in 1972 to prohibit sex discrimination in all educational programs that receive federal financial assistance, which is mostly higher education, but also covers a lot of public school systems and even some public libraries. So Title IX is only 37 words, and it's kind of core legal standard, and it says no person, meaning male or female, so no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. But as it turns out, Title IX is frequently violated. And so far to date, as of this last week, I've filed civil rights complaints with the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights against 314 U.S. colleges and universities for more than 1,000 violations of mostly Title IX's prohibition of sex discrimination and some complaints for violations of Title VI's prohibition of discrimination on the basis of race or color. And based on those more than 300 complaints that I've filed with the Office for Civil Rights, Those have resulted so far in 157 federal investigations of civil rights violations and 50 resolutions in my favor. And so after a Title IX complaint is filed with the Office for Civil Rights, then they evaluate the complaint, and then it either is dismissed because there's not enough evidence or it doesn't meet the requirements, or they open it for investigation. So I still have a lot of complaints that are still being evaluated, but 157 of the 314 have been open for federal investigations, and I've had 50 resolutions so far in my favor. So if nothing else, I think it's an interesting story, because if there was a Guinness Book of World Records category for filing Title IX complaints, I think I would qualify as the one person who has filed more Title IX complaints in the history, almost the 50-year history of Title IX. And so the Title IX complaints I've filed are mostly for single-sex, female-only programs that are discriminatory and illegal because they operate either exclusively or primarily for women, and therefore illegally discriminate against and exclude males on the basis of sex, in clear violation of Title IX. I've also filed a number of Title VI complaints for illegal discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin. So, for example, there's a number of like women of color programs that violate both Title IX and Title VI, and then there's some new development with having race-based affinity groups in higher education. I'll talk a little bit about that later, that would violate Title VI. And when there are successful resolutions of Title IX complaints with the Office for Civil Rights for discriminatory, illegal, single-sex female programs, that would generally be that a university that gets caught violating Title IX, that they would agree to discontinue the program. That happens some of the times. What is maybe more common is that there'll be a single-sex, female-only program that the university will agree to correct by converting to a co-educational program that then becomes open for all genders and gender identities. Or the discriminatory female-only program that violates Title IX could be offset with an equivalent male-only program, and that's happened a few times as well. So, under Title IX, federal civil rights law that protects everybody, a university could have separate but equal programs for males and females, or they can have all gender co-educational programs, or awards or scholarships or other types of programs. But you can't have a single-sex female-only program by itself that operates exclusively for women, students, staff, or faculty, that illegally excludes and discriminates against men unless there's a comparable equivalent male-only program. And so my research is to investigate by looking at universities' websites to see what programs I can identify that violate Title IX or Title VI. So at an average of about 4 violations per complaint for each university, and then sometimes, like for Ohio State, there's been as many as 20 allegations of Title IX violations. So I've so far identified more than 1,200 violations of Title IX's prohibition of sex discrimination at universities and colleges around the country, including, a couple different categories here that they fall into. There's a lot of girl-only STEM outreach programs that universities offer for K through 12 students, and it'll be either summer camps or year-round programs, usually for science, engineering, math, chemistry, computer science, computer forensics, cybersecurity. Those would be outreach programs that are discriminatory because they are only offered for K through 12 girls, and the boys are not included. They're illegally excluded. And then more at the university level, there's a lot of female-only, STEM programs for undergraduate and graduate students, and mostly for engineering programs, computer science, physics programs. And there are some engineering programs at the university level that have a number of discriminatory programs. They'll have female-only welcome and orientation programs that illegally exclude male students. They'll have female-only advising, female-only tutoring, female-only mentorship programs, female-only scholarships, and female-only awards, and then female-only events, dinners, meetings with industry representatives, and so on. Then there are a lot of female-only awards for students, faculty, and or staff. There's a lot of female-only scholarships, fellowships, and grants. At many universities have those. There's thousands of those that are in violation of Title IX. There's a lot of female-only programs in the area of leadership, management, negotiation, entrepreneurship, both at the undergraduate level and at the graduate level. Most of the top business schools have some kind of professional executive education programs for women only. It'll be, women in leadership, and it'll be, $5,000 to $10,000 a week for a 1-week certificate program that excludes men. There's a number of female-only political campaign programs for women who either want to go into politics or work in the area of politics, like University of Texas Austin's LBJ Women's Campaign School, which excludes men. American University has a Women in Politics Institute. There's a Women Campaign School at Yale. And I've filed complaints against all of these different programs that I've been talking about. There's even now some universities that have female-only gym hours or weight training hours or training hours, swimming pool hours, or in some cases, women have been allowed to take over the entire campus fitness facility for certain hours during the week. So I filed a number of complaints, Title IX complaints for those violations. And then there's also now violations of Title VI's prohibition of discrimination on the basis of race and color are now becoming more common now in this new period or increasing popularity of critical race theory and new kind of programs like that. And these are especially now in the form of racially segregated, race-based, what they call affinity groups. So, it sounds nice, but it's really, just repackaged old-fashioned Jim Crow segregation that where they separate and segregate students, faculty, and or staff into white identified groups that are only open for white individuals, and then separate groups for people of color or blacks or Asians or now BIPOC, the Black Indigenous people of color. And so I've filed recent complaints against Michigan State, Harvard, University of North Carolina, and Carleton College in Minnesota for race-based affinity groups, which I allege violate Title VI's prohibition of discrimination on the basis of race and skin color. And so kind of the main issue here is that every university in the country, including Northwood, that accepts federal or really, taxpayer financial assistance, which is basically every university in the country except, I think, Hillsdale College and Grove City, which, to their credit, they refuse to accept federal financial assistance. So in a way, they're not under the same obligations as everybody else. But all the other universities that accept federal financial assistance, which includes Pell Grants, federally insured student loans for their students, direct research grants, and so on, billions of dollars a year. So the universities have to regularly certify to the Department of Education that they're enforcing Title IX's prohibition of sex discrimination and Title VI's prohibition of discrimination based on race and color as a legal requirement to continue to receive taxpayer assistance or federal financial assistance. And yet most universities seem to ignore their legal obligations to enforce federal civil rights laws by offering programs that discriminate on the basis of sex and some on the basis of race in violation of Title IX and Title VI. So it's a case of what I've called widespread systemic sexism in U.S. higher education and a hypocritical double standard for enforcing Title IX. And they've done so for decades with impunity because they've never been challenged for their violations until now that I've been challenging the violations. And there's some other organizations and individuals who have kind of collaborated with me and are also challenging the federal civil rights violations. Now, it's hard to know whether universities actually just don't know they're in violation of federal civil rights laws because they see everybody else doing it, or whether they know they're violating Title IX federal civil rights laws, but they just don't care. So either they're ignorant of federal civil rights laws prohibiting sex and race discrimination, or they think they're above the law And in either case, it's a sad indictment of higher education, and that's kind of what has motivated me to try to change these, violations that haven't been challenged for many years and many decades. And it's especially, troubling because universities now, you probably know, they have small armies of what I call diversicrats and diversity officers and Title IX officers who are supposed to know how Title IX works. They're supposed to know federal civil rights laws and what constitutes a Title IX violation. The University of Michigan in Ann Arbor has more than 80 staff members with the words diversity, equity, or inclusion in their job titles at a cost of about $11 million per year, which would be in-state tuition for 700 students. The chief diversity officer at University of Michigan makes $420,000 a year plus benefits. The new chief diversity officer at Michigan State just got hired at $350,000 a year. Well, they're investing a lot in their diversity efforts. Ohio State now has more than 150 diversity and Title IX staff. So they have the resources available, but unfortunately, it seems like I'm having to do their work for them pro bono or for free because they're just, even with all of those diversity staffs, they're not enforcing the laws that legally mandate them to enforce them and legally guarantee that all students are protected by Title IX and Title VI. So it's ironic and troubling. We hear so much about diversity, inclusion, and equity is the way I say it, because then it's DIE, D-I-E, which is the new mantra in higher education. But by offering illegal single-sex female-only programs, universities in practice are demonstrating a commitment to the exact opposite. It's uniformity, exclusion of certain students, and inequity. And uniformity because it's women only in many cases. So after, about 3 years of my civil rights advocacy, there's one sign so far that in addition to the fact that there's 150 investigations and 50 resolutions, there's another sign that I guess I'm making some progress. And that's that last year, the Office for Civil Rights, which again is part of the Department of Education, they introduced two new what they called issue codes, or really their administrative classifications for Title IX investigations. And one is single-sex campus programs, and the other is single-sex scholarships. Those were never identified before as administrative categories. I guess when there were any kinds of complaints like the ones I've been filing, they would just get put into a miscellaneous category or something. But now between 150 investigations from my efforts and more than 100 investigations from a few other advocates, the Office for Civil Rights must have needed to add two new issue codes to help organize and keep track of all of these new Title IX investigations in two areas that never got any attention in the past. All right, so now to kind of fill out some of this, I'll share my screen here. Let's do this. Okay. Start sharing here. Okay, is that coming through okay, Dale?
Yes, it is. We got it.
Okay, so this is my title of my talk that is my one-man mission to advance civil rights, and I just wanted to go through some additional empirical data to kind of support what I've been doing. We've already talked about this. So this is interesting. So this is, again, some data from the higher education that I think helps supports my case of challenging Title IX violations. And this is looking at the share of fall enrollment of all degree-granting post-secondary institutions. So it's all colleges and universities, including community colleges, and all the other colleges and universities that offer four-year programs or graduate programs. And so this is looking at the share of fall enrollment by the sex of student from 1960 through 2020. And so you can see here that Title IX was passed in 1972 when it was the case that women were underrepresented in colleges. They were only 43% of enrollment, and not really because of Title IX, but because you can see the trend was in place already. But by 1979, just 7 years after Title IX was passed, women became an overrepresented majority in higher education by enrollment, and men became an underrepresented minority and have been now for more than 40 years by enrollment. And then if we look at, the share of all college degrees, and this is all based on Department of Education data, and this includes associate's degrees, bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and doctor degrees, that by 1981, 9 years after Title IX was passed, women started earning the majority of college degrees at pretty much all levels. And then again, it's showing that men for 40 years now have been an underrepresented minority, which again supports my case, because usually it's the underrepresented minorities who get either the affirmative action or a disproportionate share of resources. But in this case, it's women in higher education who are the overrepresented majority who keep and continue to get a disproportionate share of campus resources in the form of scholarships and aid and awards and programs, special programs, and so on. And then just looking at this year's class of 2021, students who are just graduating this year, again, from Department of Education data, it's showing that women got more than 61% of the associate's degrees, more than 57% of bachelor's degrees, almost 61% of the master's degrees, and 54% of doctorate degrees, and then altogether 58.9% of all degrees. So for every 100 men this year graduating with some type of college degree, there'll be 143 women getting college degrees. And actually for master's degrees, it's really imbalanced there, where for every 100 men getting a master's degree, there'll be 154 women getting a master's degree. So it's almost like we're stuck back in the 1950s or 1960s thinking that women were facing challenges or facing discrimination in higher education, when that's not really consistent with the data that I'm showing here. And then this is just looking at what I call the cumulative U.S. college degree gap in favor of women from 1982, which is around when they started earning, more degrees than men, through 2021. So over that period of almost 40 years, women have earned 15 million more college degrees than men, including 6.7 more bachelor's degrees than men over that period. So again, that has also motivated my efforts to say that, we really should not be providing special preferences for women anymore, because they've demonstrated a clear educational success in higher education. In fact, sometimes I've said that it's the largest or most remarkable educational success story maybe in the history of the country, the rise of women in higher education, and now they're outperforming men, but yet continue to receive special preferences and affirmative action. This is just using data, looking at the female share of bachelor's degree by college major, and kind of showing maybe there was a lot of, kind of churning in the 70s and 80s, but over the last, 20 years, really, this century, starting in around 2000, everything is kind of stabilized. And so it's also the case that men and women in higher education, when they select a college major, just seem to kind of self-select and, based on their revealed preferences, that just women gravitate towards certain degrees more than men, and men towards certain degrees more than women. So even biology, which is a science degree, of course, and part of STEM, that's been 60% female share of college degrees for a long time. So women are overrepresented in biology, but they're underrepresented in physical sciences. There's a number of areas here, economics, history, and so on, architecture, business, where it's almost 50-50. Even math and statistics, it's close to 50-50. And then the two fields where women have remained underrepresented are engineering and computer science, which maybe has motivated some of the violations of Title IX, because they're trying to help women achieve parity in computer science and engineering. But there's no comparable concern about the underrepresentation of men in health professions, public administration, education, and psychology. So again, it's inconsistent. If we're worried about gender imbalances, then we should first of all maybe be worried about the gender imbalance overall for college degrees. And then also we should be concerned about the underrepresentation of men in a lot of these degrees, but it seems like the only attention is on the underrepresentation of women in engineering and computer science. Now, here's what's interesting as well. Now, this is veterinary medicine, and this is looking at the gender representation at U.S. colleges of veterinary medicine. And so you can see at the early part of this time series back in 1980, men got 60, maybe 2/3 of the degrees, and women's got 1/3 of the degrees. And now over time, it's just kind of like women did a takeover of veterinary medicine, which again is to their credit, but it just kind of demonstrates that if women are really interested in a field, and if they're interested in a medical field or a science field, that there's nothing preventing them, that they can just completely take over a field like veterinary medicine. So I thought that's always been striking, that now almost 82% of veterinary medicine graduates or enrolled students are, this is for total enrollment, I guess, so that 82% of students studying veterinary medicine are women. Now, just to kind of then backtrack a little bit too, to kind of, review how I got interested in this. My initial, interest or awareness was back in 2016, where, I've been in higher education for, something like 30 years now, and I just really hadn't noticed that there was this bias or, systematic sexism or, unequal enforcement, inconsistent enforcement of Title IX. But I was in Flint, teaching at U of M Flint, and I would hear occasionally that Michigan State University had a women's only lounge, and I couldn't believe that was even possible or legal in today's environment. Again, totally illegal. It violates Title IX. It violates the Michigan State Constitution that was amended in 2006. It violates Michigan State's own statement of non-discrimination on the basis of sex, and it violated, Michigan State law for civil rights. And so I visited there, and maybe some of you could have been there, but if you go into their main student union building in the middle of campus and walk in the main entrance, the entire wing of the first floor was set aside and had a sign up saying this is a women's only lounge, and it gave the history of how long it had been there and so on. And it would have been okay if there had been a men's only lounge and a women's only lounge, so separate but equal, kind of approach. But you can't just have what I call gender apartheid, where you had this prime real estate set aside where only women could go in and men were not allowed to go in, and there was no accommodation for men that would have been equivalent. And so I filed a civil rights complaint at the state level before I was aware of how to do it at the federal level, and was able to then share my complaint was pending, and I shared it with some people in the media. And so it got reported at the state level and at the national level, including Washington Post. And so what happened is Michigan State shut the lounge down during the summer of 2016, and they remodeled it, reconfigured it, because they couldn't have just taken the sign down in the fall and said this space is open for everybody. So they had to, add men's bathrooms or reconfigure it, and then they opened it in the fall of 2016 as a space that was then conforming with Title IX and was no longer discriminatory or illegal. And that caused quite an uproar on campus, but there was just nothing that Michigan State could do at that point. I mean, it was just so clearly a violation of Title IX and state law, Michigan Constitution, and so on. So then my awareness was up that maybe that was physically symbolic of like what was happening much more, commonly, that was more invisible. And so then in 2017, I got the annual email from the provost announcing all of the different awards, the 11 awards for faculty. And then I realized that 3 I was ineligible for because they were for female only, and then 2 were for minority only. So out of the 11 faculty awards, I could only apply for 6, and 5 I was ineligible for, either based on sex or race. And so I filed a complaint internally at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor and said, I think that these 5 faculty awards are discriminatory and illegal. And they pretty quickly agreed with me and forced the Flint campus to reverse those 5 faculty awards and open them up to all faculty, and so they're no longer restricted. And then shortly after that, then I got an email that the University of Michigan Flint, like a lot of universities, including Kettering and Flint and a lot of other University of Michigan Ann Arbor, they started a new single gender girl only GEM summer camp, which was girls in engineering, math, and science summer camp. And they sent around this brochure. And again, they may not have known that it was illegal. I'm not sure. But again, I was very a little bit disappointed, because a program like this was a new program in 2017. It would have had to have probably come from the faculty, who then would have had to go to their department chairs and get it approved. Everybody signed off at the department level. Then it would have gone to the dean's office, and the dean's office would have had to, and the executive committee would have had to sign off. Then it would go to the provost office, then to the chancellor. And so 15, 20 faculty, staff, administrators saw the proposal for this program, and everybody approved it without ever thinking this might be illegal. And so I immediately, again, contacted the Title IX office in Ann Arbor and said that this program was discriminatory. And again, it's serious, because it could jeopardize University of Michigan's, federal financial assistance, as well as being, unethical and probably immoral. But there's legal consequences. So they pretty quickly agreed that this was a discriminatory program. They forced them, or made them, to convert this from a girl-only program into an all-gender program. So the program is now coeducational. And then, so it was then kind of after that experience that then I started realizing this was happening nationally. And then I turned my attention kind of to the national level and started filing Title IX complaints with the Office for Civil Rights. And then that's what's now, gone up to more than 300 complaints, including about 50 allegations against the University of Michigan Ann Arbor, which is under investigation. The problem is it's been under investigation now for 2 years. So the Office for Civil Rights often moves very slowly, and if the universities resist making changes, then it can kind of drag out for a long time. But University of Michigan Ann Arbor is under federal investigation now for multiple civil rights violations. This is a slide of Oakland University's. This is their School of Engineering and Computer Science. Says they're committed to introducing high school and pre-college students to STEM resources. And so this is a summary of their summer STEM outreach programs that they have for as young as elementary students who are in grades 3 through 5. They have some for middle school and some for high school. So they separate students based on their age or their grade level, but they never mention sex. They never mention boys or girls. It's just, they have these 28 programs in all different areas of STEM, including coding and energy and robotics and a car camp and so on. And they're all open to all students of all gender identities. So again, this is kind of what I would consider to be like the civil rights gold standard, that if a university, to their credit, if they want to encourage more students to go into STEM or study STEM, and they do it at the K through 12 level, that they have programs that are open to everybody and are not discriminatory. But to know that there's a lot of universities that then say, well, we're going to have programs like this, but they're going to be for girls only, and the boys are just out of luck. They're on their own. We're not going to accommodate them, even though they might be just as interested or more interested in some of these topics as their female counterparts. So this is kind of, again, what I'm seeing as the outcome that I would think would be ideal, would be that universities offer programs without regard to gender, without regard to sex. And I give credit to Oakland University for having what I consider the gold standard of civil rights in this area. So then, just to kind of summarize here, and then we can go to Q&A. This is a kind of a summary of my goals from my civil rights efforts, and that's to end what I call the systemic sexism in higher education, and the selective double standard for enforcement of Title IX that has prevailed since Title IX was passed almost 50 years ago, to hold universities accountable for their legal obligations to enforce Title IX and Title VI, and that's a requirement of them. Again, getting federal financial assistance is conditioned on their agreeing to enforce federal civil rights laws. And then I'm trying to ensure that federally guaranteed civil rights apply to everybody and not just some, and to ensure that Title IX and Title VI apply to all and not just some preferred groups. And so that's kind of my mission, is to try to achieve justice for all in America's higher education. So now if I can stop sharing the screen here, let's see.
You're good.
Are we good now?
You stop sharing. You're good.
Okay.
Okay.
So those are my comments. So I'm happy to take questions or have a discussion from here.
Okay. I want to encourage people to put their questions in the Q&A folder on the right-hand side of your screen. And Mark, thank you for that enlightening presentation. Now, I'm sure that you're aware that there's a difference between the way people use the word equality and the word equity. And some people might say that some of these programs that you've targeted are there to promote equity. And perhaps you're suing on the basis of inequality. Do you want to respond to that? I mean, I can imagine that many people find these lawsuits inequitable, even though they do promote equality.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's not a lawsuit, and I'm not suing. So that's kind of a common misperception that what I'm doing is I'm filing a Title IX complaint with the Office for Civil Rights, and anybody can do this, and you don't have to have what's called legal standing, or I don't myself have to have suffered what would be an individualized injury, and I'm not suing for damages. I'm just saying, Title IX exists. Universities say that they're enforcing it when they really aren't, so they really should enforce this. And according to Title IX, or according to the Office for Civil Rights, universities are not allowed to say, well, there's some national data showing that women are underrepresented in, computer science or engineering. So therefore, we're going to discriminate against men to help women in the name of, as you might say, equity. Universities are not allowed to do that. So even the Office for Civil Rights is not allowing equity as a reason generally. If a university themselves or itself has in the past discriminated on the basis of sex, then they can use corrective measures to correct their past discrimination. So if universities had discriminated in the past against women in some way, then they could discriminate now against men to make up for the discrimination against women in the past. But even that, it's kind of like you're saying, well, we're going to discriminate further today to try to, make up for discrimination in the past. It just doesn't seem like that's logical. And the whole area of equity, I think that's been kind of a perversion of equality, because equity really then assumes that some groups are more deserving than others. And it's a perversion, I think, of Martin Luther King's a standard of judging people by their character and not by their skin colors. So to say that we're going to judge people now on the basis of their genitals or their skin color, I don't think that's moving us forward, and I think it's moving us backwards. And so I don't buy the idea. And I mean, universities might say, well, yeah, we're rejecting equality on the basis of sex. We're going to have favoritism for one sex over the other in the name of social equity. But I don't think that that's legal, and I don't think that it's moral, and I don't accept it as an approach.
Okay. I'm going to try and some of the questions here. Here's a question about Title IX. Do you think that Title IX might be leading to some undesirable consequences? In other words, it seems to me like this person is asking whether or not Title IX itself is flawed. John Berger's Datonomics notes that men may be underrepresented in college because they develop more slowly than women, and says that boys should enter K through 12 a year or two later than women, but this would violate Title IX. I'm not sure if it would violate Title IX, but this is an example of how men and women may be different in a fundamental way and should be treated differently?
Well, and I think a lot of this goes back before men get to college, and I think that deserves some attention and discussion as well, because maybe it's by the time men get to be college age, they've already faced discrimination or less favorable treatment than their female counterparts starting in elementary school. So I mean, there is some it's a little bit outside of my area of economics, but I think in terms of sociology and philosophy, maybe, or people like Christina Summers, that they would say that there's kind of a bias against boys starting in grade school. I think, first of all, I mean, I went through elementary, junior high, high school, well, up, I guess from K through 8, I never had a male teacher. So especially at the elementary school level, it's mostly women teachers. And so the claim has been made that, that there's a bias in elementary and middle school in favor of women and girls' style of learning, and that maybe boys are more disruptive. And so it's, possible that, the girls are treated more favorably, or the education system is more geared towards their learning styles, so that there could be that kind of bias starting from first grade on, in favor of women against boys. And so that maybe that's why men now have not gone into college at the same rate that they used to, or that the female share of college students and college graduates has increased. So I don't think that, though, in terms of Title IX, I think it's a pretty clear law. I think it's pretty, I think most people agree that everybody should be treated equally. And so I don't know that we need any revisions to Title IX, or any updates to it. So I don't know exactly if I answered that question, but I'm not sure that I understood completely what the question was. But
Well, I don't know if I understood it completely, but I think that answer did address the question. Regardless of the fundamental, perhaps differences, biological differences between the way men and women develop, you're saying we should treat them, I mean, from your point of view, Title IX is correct in calling for them to be treated equally, regardless of any biological differences in their development.
yeah, that at the college level, that neither men nor women should be discriminated against on the basis of sex, or should be excluded from any type of discrimination or any type of program. Or I guess you could even say that maybe a university might say that they're having, high school STEM camp, and they want the girls to have a separate camp than the boys because maybe there's differences in learning styles, or there's educational benefits from single sex programs. And that would be okay, but as long as then there's a single sex program for high school girls and then an equivalent single sex program for high school boys, that would be fair and equitable and legal. But it's just that I think we've really kind of, not met the goals that we should have by having so many programs where the women and girls get such preference over the boys, especially when, as I mentioned, that it's men and boys who are falling behind now. And, we see this not just in higher education, but, there's more men than women who are homeless, and there's more men than women who commit suicide. There's more men than women who are incarcerated. 92% of federal prisoners are male. There's more men that are victims of violent crimes than women. There's more men than women who have drug and alcohol issues. There's more men die on the job than women. There's more men who overdose than women. So, it might be part of a bigger picture that not only are men, underrepresented in higher education, they're also overrepresented in many areas of negative outcomes, not just educational, but also other socioeconomic and health issues and mental health and so on. So just seems, again, that we need to pay a little more attention or have a little more balanced approach when we think of, I mean, just one example, Obama created a council on women and girls, and I think Biden's doing the same thing, but then they don't create a council on men and boys to think about, well, maybe men and boys are having some challenges that should be addressed, but we're going to ignore those. We're only going to focus on the challenges or issues facing women and girls. So again, it's just part of this imbalanced approach overall that might start in, grade school, carries through to high school and college, and then results in a lot of problems for men and boys, who many of whom are struggling, but don't get the same attention that the girls would get if they face those challenges, or maybe even girls and women are getting a lot of attention, even though the problems and challenges they're facing aren't as serious as the ones faced by men and boys. So a lot to think about.
Yeah, when you speak about, the question reminds me, coincidentally, I was reading a biography of Ty Cobb, the baseball player, today. Not thinking that I would come across anything relevant to our discussion this morning, I discovered the original president of the American Psychological Association, speaking about boys' education, said we need to encourage boys to get into fights at least once a week. They need to fight. And that is a very interesting way that we thought about male education at the time. I think if anything, we would consider that to be just horrible. Boys should be taught to behave. Boys should be taught to be orderly. My wife works at an elementary school, and she helps the kids stay on their medications. And frankly, it is the boys predominantly who are coming to be medicated, and it raises the issue, and you raised it earlier, whether there are significant differences in the style of learning of boys and girls, and whether we are as aware of these differences as we need to be, and as whether we're doing enough to accommodate them. Okay, I want to move on beyond this to the next question, which is dealing with, I think, discrimination beyond higher education. So Vanira asks, considering all the discrimination, what do you think is the most discouraging or common challenging factor that women are dealing with in terms of discrimination? And she mentions a few possibilities: lack of access to the labor market, the wage gap, the glass ceiling. Care to comment on some of the challenges facing women?
Yeah, that's a valid point, and men and women both face different challenges. I guess kind of my advocacy in this area, at least, has been that men and women have equal protection under the law in higher education. And so that's what kind of motivated my efforts to make sure that neither men or women are discriminated against in higher education. Now, beyond college, private organizations, because they're not receiving federal financial assistance, now they can get away with, or they can accommodate women and minorities, underrepresented minorities, differently because they're not accepting federal financial assistance. So it's kind of the key in higher education is once you accept federal financial assistance, that requires the university then to enforce Title IX and Title VI. But once you get outside of the university into, let's say, corporate America, then they're not bound by Title IX. So they could offer, let's say, a special program for women only, for a summer internship, or for minority students only. And they do that. Now, the only problem is a university is not supposed to advertise that or promote it because they're under Title IX, whereas a private, let's say an investment bank, Morgan Stanley, or any other private company, they could have programs to help women specifically. So they're allowed, I guess, to discriminate on the basis of sex or race or color in ways that universities are not. So then I guess we could debate whether, which should that be allowed or not. But again, a private company could have special programs to promote women. And in terms of the labor market, I don't know. It just seems like in today's world that that women almost might have an advantage, or like Jason Riley said the other night that blacks are often privileged in ways that whites aren't. And so I guess in some ways I could make the case, I guess, that women are privileged over men because, again, if you had an equally qualified male and female candidate, it would seem like at the university level for sure, and maybe at the corporate level, that then the preference would be to hire a female candidate over the male candidate, even if they're equally qualified, or maybe even if the male candidate was more qualified. So it seems like that's an example of where it could be that women receive special preferences even outside of college. And then if we get into the wage gap, I mean, that would require a long discussion, but I guess you could also make the case that there really is no gender earnings gap once you account for all of the various factors that could account for differences in earnings. That would include the choice of career, the number of hours worked, family choices, and so on. And to the extent that there is discrimination in the labor market, of course, women are protected by the Equal Pay Act. That prevents a company or any organization from paying a man more than a woman for the same exact job. So there's protections there. So, I guess, discrimination is going to exist within higher education and out in the general labor market. But the point is that we do have federal civil rights laws that are supposed to protect everybody. And so that is supposed to ensure quality under the law in higher education and also in the labor market. And so I think there's protections there to help women who might suffer from discrimination. They have legal protections that are important and should be enforced.
Here's a fascinating question. Women earn more degrees than men. They're going into college at higher rates. And how does the cause and effect work here? Is this because of the wage gap, because of the glass ceiling, because of this past discrimination, that women are investing more in human capital as a way to overcome perhaps systemic sexism in the marketplace or in response to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, again, when I showed that chart, this is a very long trend that goes way back to the 1960s, where, again, to their credit, women, I mean, you could make the case that at least in some cases, they're better students than men, and so they've been more successful. I mean, if you look at high school, more high school girls and high school boys take advanced placement classes. They take more honors classes. More, girls take more math and science classes now than boys. They have higher GPAs than boys on average. More girls and boys graduate in the top 5 or 10% of their class. So, I mean, it might just be that women have been more successful at the high school level. That translates into being more successful at the college level. I mean, and maybe if you traced it back, it could be because it's been this gradual feminization of education. So girls do better in elementary and middle school, and then they do better in high school, and then they do better in, in college. I think it's also, women have just become empowered in general. And so it's much more common now and has been for a long time for women to pursue higher education and higher education degrees. So again, I mean, it's to their credit that they're highly motivated. Now, starting about 10 years ago, women get more doctoral degrees than men. So just every level of higher education, women have demonstrated a remarkable success story. So in terms of, I think the trend has been going on for a long time, and maybe a lot of things could explain it. Could be that people have smaller families now, or that women are able to be single and be successful, whereas in the past, maybe that wasn't quite the case. So I just think gradual changes over time have made it very favorable towards women being successful in higher education and also successful in the labor market. And again, it's something I think that should be recognized and even celebrated. But then on the other hand, we shouldn't be pretending like we're back in the 1950s or 1960s and that women are facing all of these different challenges and obstacles that might have been the case in the past, but they aren't today, and then using that as a justification for giving women special preferences, more scholarships than men, more awards, and so on. So I don't know exactly about the cause and the effect, but it's just we've seen this happening gradually over time, and maybe it happened so gradually that people didn't even recognize it or pay close attention, but now it seems like that there's such a huge imbalance that we should really think about, if anything should be done now that there's this huge gender imbalance in favor of women and to the disfavor of men. Is there anything that we should be doing? Should we be starting at the, elementary school level? Should we have more councils for men and boys, even at the presidential level, to kind of address some of these situations? So there's a lot of interesting socioeconomic implications that sometimes go beyond my area of expertise as an economist, where I'm also just trying to have Title IX enforced, uniformly. So in some cases, I don't know exactly about all of the other bigger picture issues, but I try to understand them as well as I can.
So your expertise and training is as an economist, and that gives rise to two questions. One, what are you doing with this Title IX? Have you experienced discrimination yourself? Is this personal for you? It's obviously not part of your academic training or interest. However, before you answer that question, I want to lose track of this other question I have for you. Are you the person who coined the term man session to describe what happened after 2008? I know you've used that in your blog.
Yeah, well, I did get some credit for doing all of the research that led to a description of the Great Recession as the man session. I think it was some media outlet that was reporting on my work that they actually used the term man session, but then that became associated because I guess I was back in 2007, 2008 during the Great Recession. I was the one who started noticing the hugely disproportionate outcomes for men and women during the Great Recession and how the job losses were so much greater for men than for women, and the unemployment rate for men was so much higher than for women because all of the sectors that were affected were mostly male dominated. So for example, construction, which I don't know, I think is maybe 90% male, the construction industry collapsed due to the housing bubble and so on. So the construction collapsed, so that was mostly men who lost jobs there. Manufacturing suffered a little bit, and that was about 70% male. Then maybe all of the financial services and investment banking positions that were affected were also more male dominated than female. So yeah, so it was, and then I actually testified before Congress on this, but it was maybe my initial awareness that men were being disproportionately affected by the Great Recession than women, that then led to the term man session, and that was associated with some of the research that I had been doing in the Great Recession.
Yeah, so is that what led you to this Title IX stuff, or is it the reverse? Is it something personal?
No, it was never anything personal other than the fact that I realized that I was being affected, I guess, because there were 5 faculty awards that I was ineligible for, but it was never, I never suffered, I guess, what would be called an individualized injury in any way. It just really, I started becoming aware of what I thought was a blind spot in higher education, that they were allowing this systemic sexism that I really found kind of offensive, as well as being illegal. I just thought it was just unfair and inequitable, even though we hear about, equity and inclusion, and then I see this exclusion and inequity and uniformity that just really, I think I was troubled by it and felt that I was in a position to do something about it because I was, a full professor with tenure and didn't have to worry about job security really. And then was also, have become aware that there are many, many other professors and students who are just as offended by this as I am, but almost everybody else is unwilling to do it publicly, or to complain publicly, or to complain internally. So maybe about 15% of my Title IX complaints have been referrals that I got, where there's a number of professors at top universities who were also aware of this ongoing discrimination against men in their fields, science fields especially. They were afraid to challenge it publicly because they were afraid of the repercussions and the retribution and so on. So they would inform me of the discrimination that they knew was going on at their university, and then I have filed, probably 20 complaints maybe on behalf of professors or students who were unwilling to do it under their own name, and I did it under my name and kept them anonymous. So it wasn't just me by myself thinking that this is a problem or is troubling. It really is. I've been contacted by many students and parents and faculty who are just as troubled as I am, but are often unwilling to challenge it themselves. And I've done it so much now, it's easy for me to do it. So I've kind of become a watchdog, I guess, and have worked on behalf of many faculty and students who are, and alumni and parents who are as troubled by this as I am.
Do you you say you've won many of these, but it seems like you've perhaps not won a greater number. And what is the basis by which colleges can defend their policies and perhaps win?
Yeah, well, I mean, what's happened is that, I'm just was reporting on the statistics to date, and often, the Office for Civil Rights, like any federal bureaucracy, they move pretty slowly. So it often will take a year just to evaluate a complaint, and then once they open an investigation, I've had several investigations now, including one against Wayne State and one against University of Michigan, that have been open now for more than 2 years. So that's the Title IX process and complaint and evaluation and investigation process, they move very, very slowly. So I'm just kind of filing complaints and then hoping in the long run that they'll all be resolved. And I think what happens also is that if the university is stubborn and they resist making changes, that can delay the eventual resolution for a long time. But the way that universities, and I find this kind of disingenuous and dishonest, but here's what they'll do sometimes, and this has happened for some of the female executive programs, one at Stanford and one at UC Berkeley, where they create a program and they'll say this program was created for women by women. They'll run a program like a women's executive leadership program for many, many years. It'll be all women participants. They'll describe the program as for mid-level or senior level female executives. Then they'll get caught, and then they'll be contacted by the Office for Civil Rights and say, there's this crazy complainant here, Mark Perry, who's saying that your program is discriminatory. You're going to have to fix it or discontinue it. And so then what they'll do to kind of what they think will fix it is they'll make the minimal amount of changes that will be acceptable to the Office for Civil Rights. And they'll do it by adding one category and say that the program is open to any gender or participants of any gender who want to study female leadership. So then it's kind of like they're protected legally, even though a man sees that and is going to know, well, that's not the program for me, even though it says I'm technically eligible. Or there'll be a program, Ann Arbor has a lot of these, where it'll be a program for girls, it's operated for girls, but then they'll slightly change the requirements and say, while this program is open to all genders, it really is designed to promote women in, music and technology or STEM or something like that. So they kind of pretend that it's coeducational, even though it really isn't. But that's one way that they can try to protect themselves, is to kind of pretend that men and women are both eligible, even though it's still called the girls' summer STEM camp in engineering. So sometimes they can get away with that.
here's a question. I do want to follow up with your man session research in a minute, though. But we do have one more question that's been, Callista's been waiting a long time for an answer here. Do you have any statistics that show the amount of women hired into full-time jobs directly out of college compared to men?
Well, yes, the Bureau of Labor Statistics does put out reports on young adults, I think they call it, and they report on recent college graduates, and they report on, high school students and college students. And so I think it is the case that more women than men now graduating, since they graduate from college at a higher rate or higher level, then they generally also get more jobs than men out of college just because they have a disproportionate share of college degrees. So there is a annual report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics where they look at recent college graduates, and I just wrote a report on it recently. Some of the exact statistics I'm a little hazy on right now, but there are data showing jobs and how many college graduates are working, how many are not working. I don't know if they break it down between part-time and full-time, but there is a report that the Bureau of Labor Statistics produces annually on those data.
And we have another question here. First of all, complimenting you on your presentation, and then saying, do you see a connection between some of the trends that you've described and family structure, the lack of fathers in the home?
I think, that when you look at, even the broader picture and look at homelessness and interactions with law enforcement and incarceration and being victims of violent crimes and then drug addiction and alcohol addiction and overdosing and incarceration, all those issues, I think that often could be traced back to the home life. And in fact, I just did a chart showing, I think the percentage of births to unwed mothers and then the percentage and share of college degrees by race. And so there is a correlation between, the percentage of births to unwed mothers by race and then the percentage of that population, that ethnic group, in terms of the share of that group that gets college degrees. So there are, a lot of factors, a lot of issues that can be traced back to the number or share of boys or women growing up in a single parent home, usually a mother and without a father. So there could be some connection there to the outcomes later in life that could be then, correlated with the way that they were raised and the home life that they had and the quality of that home life and whether there was a single parent or two parents.
So I want to get back to this idea of a man session. And of course, we've had another serious recession associated with COVID, a lot of structural unemployment that will result from this. I believe some of the changes that have happened in the labor market will be permanent. Some of the industries have been affected are not coming back to the extent that they used to. And so that might have a disparate effect by gender, depending on what kinds of jobs are lost permanently and how easy it is for people once disconnected to reconnect with the labor force. So I do see some parallels now between now and 2008. Is there something we can learn from 2008 to say something about what to expect in our recovery now from 2021?
Yeah, that's a good question because, again, if you think of displaced workers from certain industries that got affected more than others, that can be a long-term adjustment process. I mean, just one example would be, now the construction sector is booming and they're complaining about a shortage of workers in construction, whereas that was the industry that was most affected during the Great Recession in 2008 and 2009. So eventually those jobs came back, but it took a long time. And so then people are not going to be able to just necessarily wait around for 10 years or more before the jobs come back. And so they're going to have to make career changes. And now what's interesting is there was a little bit of discussion during this current recession that it was a C session, that it was more affecting women. And so there's even some reports, because I think in some early, maybe a year ago, there were some industries, or at least when they were looking at the number of unemployed workers or the unemployment rates, it seemed like for the initial stages of the pandemic that women were being a little bit more adversely affected than men. I mean, it was never to the extent that the disparity, in 2008, 2009, when it was just such a huge gap between male-female unemployment rates. This time there was a period when female unemployment rates were a little higher than male unemployment rates, but I think that's all kind of now come back to kind of normal, where they're about the same for both male and female.
Yeah. One of the things that occurs to me is because of the movement to change education to online education, because of the closure of daycare centers, and this resulted in more parental responsibility, to the extent that the woman takes on a greater burden for that child care. It seems that by itself would have a disproportionate effect on women. And hopefully a temporary effect as schools reopen and daycare centers reopen.
Yeah, there was, even at the White House level, they were talking about the disparate impact of COVID on women more than men, although they failed to mention that more men have died than women. So in terms of fatalities, it's clearly the case that more men than women. But in terms of childcare, so if childcare falls more, the responsibility of childcare falls more on the mother than the father, then there was some concern that the effects of COVID were impacting women more than men in terms of things like in the area of childcare. So that was obviously a concern. And so now, as we're hopefully kind of emerging out of this, hopefully that will be kind of less of an issue. But at least over the last year or so, there were certain examples or certain factors where women were more impacted than men, except for the death rate, where women had a much smaller death rate than for men.
Well, Mark, I want to give you an opportunity here to close your presentation with any final thoughts for us. Anything that you want us to take away from this work?
Yeah, well, I hope you found it interesting. Again, it's something that no one else has ever done before, so I kind of feel like a little bit of a trailblazer. I'm just kind of been doing it as just a one-man mission. I hope that I remain successful. It's yet to be determined how, if anything, will change under the Biden administration compared to the Trump administration. I think the Department of Education and Office for Civil Rights was probably more favorable to my efforts under the Trump administration and Betsy DeVos than now. So I don't know, that might change, although, it's career staff attorneys who are supposed to be enforcing federal civil rights laws. And so those same staff attorneys will be there kind of doing the work of evaluation. But I do report occasionally about my efforts on my blog. So along with many other types of economic issues, and some of, gender disparity issues. And so if you follow my blog, I think Dale put it in the chat area, that you could follow Carpe Diem blog, where I write about this topic as well as many other topics that really maybe more directly related to economics. So, but I'm happy to participate again with a very stellar panel of presenters. I watched Jason Riley's talk the other night, and we'll try to watch some more today. So thank you for allowing me to be part of your seminar this year, and maybe we'll do it again next year, depending on the topic.
Thank you, Mark. It was a pleasure to have you here again, and I'm sure we'll be seeing you in the future.
All right. Thank you, Dale, and thanks to everybody else who was listening.